Welcome to this audio podcast. The audio portion is found only on the video channel at youtube.com, Old Stuff Show, and you would search under the title of this podcast, Unusual Happenings in London, Ontario's Past. Can you believe it? So, what we're going to do in this podcast, and we'll share some very interesting, unusual things that have happened in London that I've researched and talked to people about over the past number of years, and we'll share those with you today. So again, the concept here of this podcast is to use the audio only, although you're finding it on a video channel, but it's going to be recorded as only the audio, and so. We'll look at some of the unusual happenings in London, Ontario's past, and see if, in fact, we can really believe it. But I tend to believe most of it, to be honest with you. One of the people I talked to was a lady who said that her brother was a Canadian hero, and I wasn't sure what she was talking about, but she said that her brother joined the Canadian Army in 1914 as a 14-year-old with his mother's permission, apparently, and spent 4 years in France, and not on the front line, but as a bugler. Came back, and he was enthralled by the new thing called an airplane, and he joined the Air Force in Great Britain, and stayed there for a while, and then went to the United States and joined the American Air Force, where he became very successful and eventually became a brigadier general of the Selfridge Air Force Base. He was also one of the planners of the D-Day invasion, and he died and was buried in Arlington Cemetery. The unusual thing is he's a Londoner, and he's not being recognized, and very few people, if any, know about him. So if he was American, I assume he would be given quite a honor by perhaps naming a street after him, or having a plaque, or having some kind of monument. But here in London, we have forgotten Ted, and maybe sometime somebody listening to this would want to research him further and perhaps give him some kind of recognition. In London also, we had characters, and one of the characters was a man who was a junk collector, basically, and he would go down the street with his horse and buggy. The horse wore a straw hat, apparently, and stockings, and he would holler out junk-a-ho and be collecting bottles and rags and so on. And I think the unusual part of that is he represented a time in society, and this would go back to the 1930s, when recycling, former recycling, was very much alive, and not something that just happened in our society recently. It's something that was done on a regular basis in London in those days. But he was an unusual character, and a lot of people that I talked to did remember him. Of course, the unusual happenings in London in the past was the fact that there were many home deliveries by horse and wagon, and that involved bread and milk and ice and so on. And there was a bread man who had a horse that he claimed was the smartest horse in London, and this horse would pretty well not have to be told where to go because he knew the route. And one day this bread man went to visit a lady's home to sell her something, and she wanted something that he only had back in the wagon. He went back to the wagon and got it. The horse thought that, and then he left and gave it to the lady, but the horse thought that he had got in the wagon and it was ready to go. And on goes the horse to the next stop, which happened to be the market, which was several blocks away. And eventually the bread man did catch up to the horse that was waiting for him there. Rather unusual, to say the least. Can you believe it? It's amazing. Also in London, we had quite a history of the market downtown. And if you were to look at some older postcards and pictures of the market outside in the 1920s, 30s, but mainly in the 20s and earlier, there were horses and buggies that just crowded the whole square that we know of today. The market in those days, though, was facing on King Street, the market building. And there was a weigh scale there, and farmers would come in with things that had to be weighed, and they would be paid accordingly or charged accordingly if they were buying something. So downtown was thriving, and I suppose in some ways that we would say today, can you believe it? But certainly London was a busy place downtown with many, many stores, and certainly the market was booming. Another thing that we remember about London is the streetcar system. We did have a streetcar system up to early 1940s. Can you believe that? Something today that we would maybe benefit from. They seem to, in Toronto, be able to maintain that system and keep it going, but they tore it all out in 1941, I believe, and it was electrified. They took down all the electric overhead cables and the tracks, pulled them out, and got rid of some of the cars. I learned that what's unusual about this is that I learned that some of these cars were actually shipped out west and to one of the towns, and they were used in their transit system there. And somehow or other, if you can believe this, one of the cars ended up in Edmonton at the Edmonton Radio Streetcar Society, and they restored it, and they pretty well put it back to the way it was with colors and everything. Can you believe that? It's quite amazing. But again, we lost it. We're talking today about transit and spending an awful lot of money on things like that, but seemed to be something that was very available and affordable in those days. London, Ontario, too, we had some major department stores. I think the older people today would fondly remember the Christmas windows at the old Simpsons store, and even before that at Smallman and Ingram. And these mechanical displays were quite something. They were well put together, and it's hard to believe that mechanically that was all very possible, but it was a very big attraction for young people, and they were brought down to see that, especially every Christmas. We also had one department store named Kingsmills, and the family owned that for some 140 years, and until it was sold recently. And I guess the interesting thing about it, the unusual thing about that store, one of the unusual things, is that the elevator was one of the earliest elevators of its kind, and it still is there, even though Fanshawe College has renovated that building. They've kept the old elevator. And the elevator, another unusual thing, for all those years was run by a person who was the elevator attendant, and that person would greet you and take you up to the floor of your choice and close the big door and open the big door, and very hard to believe in terms of today's society. Another thing that's quite unusual in many ways is the existence still of the old Blackfriars Bridge. That bridge was built in Ohio, which is unusual in itself, and then was put together. The parts were sent up to London and put together by the contractors, and has stayed until this very day. And again, it has been renovated recently, but it has been around for some time. And there's a plaque down there that you can read and take a look at it and appreciate the fact that it's stayed there for so many years. So again, can you believe that? It's very interesting for sure. London started off when Simcoe visited the Forks of the Thames in the late 1700s, and kind of had it in his mind that he was going to make it the capital of Upper Canada, and there was land actually set aside, and it's been set aside for a number of years, except the plan had changed, and that did not happen, and it was moved over to, I believe, Niagara area, and then on to the Toronto area. So it's something that I suppose would have been quite something but hard to believe that we would become the capital of Ontario today. Another very unusual thing in my mind is the fact that London had two major breweries that started here. One still is here, Labatt's, of course, and the Carling Brewery Company was started here too, and it was located just south of the Oxford Street Bridge along the river there, and it burned down and then was moved to Toronto. But would have been something to have two major breweries in London, Ontario at this particular time. Hard to believe that that would be possible, of course. And I talked to one man, this is a very unusual story, who lived across the river from the Carling Brewery, and when he was a young person on a very hot day, he said they had a tap on the outside of the building and a mug, and you could help yourself to a mug of beer. And he found out about this. He was very young, and when it was really hot, he would bicycle across and he'd grab a mug of beer and have a little bit of drink in a hot day. Can you believe that? It's kind of unusual in terms of today, but it did happen. He became a very prominent educator in the city, and he loved to tell that story. So those are some of the unusual happenings in our past in London, Ontario. Hard to believe many of them. It's something that only would happen in days gone by. Certainly many of them wouldn't be happening today. So I hope you've enjoyed those stories, and we'll find some more for you in another podcast, and the audio podcast on youtube.com under Old Stuff Show. Just simply search Unusual Happenings in London, Ontario's Past. Can you believe it? To hear this again. Thanks for your time, and we'll talk to you next time.